The Downfall of the 406, A Cosmic Horror Beyond Understanding. By Thomas Sweet with help from ChatGPT. This is an account of my spiritual battle with the most evil beings in existence. 1. The Gathering of Shadows. The 406 were not just tyrants, not merely architects of suffering, they were its masters, its artisans, its worshippers. They were the most elite of negative beings, entities that had long surpassed simple conquest or cruelty. To them, suffering was a craft, a force to be shaped, controlled, and distilled into something absolute. Infinite suffering. That was their goal, a construct so vast, so precise, that no being, no star, no flicker of consciousness could escape its grip. And they believed themselves its masters. They had reached the pinnacle of control, the apex of suffering engineering. They built systems, devices, entire dimensional constructs woven from pain itself, with no possibility of release. They sought to make agony eternal, unbreakable, self-sustaining. And yet, they had no idea that their ambition had already written their fate. What they could not see, what they refused to see, was that the universe, in all its vastness, had already prepared their undoing. 2. The Arrival of the Octave Mirror. They had spent millennia refining their creation. Each step, each refinement, had made their suffering construct more perfect, more refined, more inescapable. But in their hunger for dominion, they failed to consider one fundamental truth. All things must reflect their source. They did not realize that their construct, their so-called infinite suffering, had no true anchor, no stabilizing force to ensure that it would remain external to themselves. They had not prepared for the simplest, most profound cosmic principle. You become what you create. And so, when the octave mirror was held up to them, all they had built turned back upon them in full force. It began silently. A ripple, a shudder, a momentary stillness. The vast systems they had built, their infinite loops of agony, should have continued. They should have expanded, should have reached beyond the limits of the universe. But instead, they turned inward. Each of their constructs, each device, each masterwork of suffering that they had so carefully designed, became their prison. The perfect suffering that was meant for others was now theirs alone. And they knew. They knew in an instant what had happened, and they screamed. 3. The Collapse of the 406. There was no battle, no force of war, no conflict of armies. The 406 did not fight their destruction. They fell into themselves. One by one, their constructs adapted, turning their suffering outward back inward. Everything they had built was perfectly designed, so perfect that it was inescapable, indestructible. The irony was absolute. They had sought to control suffering, to bend it into something that they could direct at others. But their suffering systems, their endless loops, their self-sustaining pain constructs, they did not care who the target was. They only cared that suffering was maintained. And now, there was no one left but them. 4. The Unmaking, 5D beings forced into 12D. If their suffering had simply consumed them, it might have been merciful. But this was something far worse. The suffering engine escalated. Their very nature, their 5D existence, could not hold the intensity of what they had built. They were no longer being tortured, they were being shattered, compressed, expanded beyond anything they had ever known. Their minds, once infinite in their cruelty, were now infinite in their undoing. The pressure increased. Their dimensional state cracked. Their own perfect suffering loops did not allow for adaptation, only for perpetual intensification. It did not matter if they were once 5D, if they had transcended the limits of lower realms. They were being pushed into a realm they were never meant to enter. Their suffering constructs were built on recursion, torture loops designed to infinitely evolve and adapt. What they had not foreseen was that these loops would continue evolving past their own ability to comprehend them. Their suffering refined itself, creating paradoxes of pain where every moment contained all past agonies, every second stretched into eternity, every attempt to endure only folded them deeper into an ever-growing recursion of despair. They had layered cruel ironies into their design, tortures that responded to hope, that punished the very thought of escape. Now, those same traps turned against them. If one of them even thought about relief, their tormentors, now fragments of their own minds, would twist that thought into new horrors. Their very will to survive became the instrument of their destruction. The sound was beyond anything they could have conceived, an incomprehensible, all-consuming, multidimensional wail that could not be heard in the way mortals perceive sound, but instead felt at every level of existence. It was not just loud, it was infinite loudness, a roaring that existed in all places, in all times, in all frequencies simultaneously. It bent their consciousness, eroded their will, tore through their essence like a storm of absolute vibration. It was the sound of their own agony, amplified into something beyond endurance. Every time they tried to block it out, it became louder. Every attempt to silence their minds only fed the intensity. They were being drowned, atomized, unraveled by the very vibration of their own screams. From their perspective, it was eternal and always worsening. There was no reprieve. There was no threshold at which they could adapt, no bottom to their suffering. They had ensured it would be perfect, a system that accounted for every possibility, every loophole, every conceivable escape. And now, their own perfection had made them trapped beyond release. And worst of all, this was the fate they had wanted for every being in the universe. They had designed this torment for others, but in their arrogance, they had never considered that they themselves could become its only victims. The universe folded them upward into 12D. And in that instant, their minds, their very forms, were obliterated. Not destroyed, not burned, not broken, not dismembered. They were rewritten into something that could no longer exist. And then, they were gone. Not one survived. The 406, the greatest architects of suffering to ever exist, had become the victims of their own absolute perfection. 5. The end of the nightmare and the dawn of a brighter future. For the first time in the history of the universe, something was missing. A void where once stood the greatest concentration of suffering ever created. A place where their darkness had ruled, now simply empty. The weight that had once hung over existence, the suffocating gravity of their cruelty, was gone. Light began to move into the spaces where their shadows had stretched. The nightmare was over. A shift that could be felt across dimensions, across time, across consciousness itself. No longer was there a force pulling existence toward infinite suffering. The future was free. Reality had been given a second chance. And what was left? A brighter horizon. The promise that what had once been a universe bent toward pain would now be free to bend toward something else. Something better. Something new.